Most people assume the brain simply interprets reality. That assumption feels reasonable. It suggests the world is out there, complete and objective, and the brain's job is to translate it into something usable. Interpretation sounds passive, like reading subtitles on a screen. But this is where the deeper mechanism is missed. Interpretation is not neutral. It is selective. And selection changes everything. The brain does not receive reality in full and then comment on it. It filters first. It prioritizes. It excludes. From an overwhelming field of possible information, it collapses one coherent stream and presents that stream as what is happening. The experience you call reality is not the total field. It is the result of what was allowed through. This is where the radio analogy becomes precise. A radio does not create music, but it also does not hear everything. Multiple broadcasts exist simultaneously in the same space. The radio selects one frequency and ignores the rest. Nothing about the environment changes, yet the experience changes completely depending on where the dial rests. Your brain operates in the same way. From countless possible meanings, outcomes, interpretations, and trajectories, it tunes into one and renders it as lived experience. This does not mean reality is imaginary. It means reality is filtered. Two people can stand in the same place, encounter the same event, and walk away living in different worlds because different information was selected, emphasized, and stabilized. What felt obvious to one was invisible to the other. What felt threatening to one felt neutral to another. These are not opinions layered on top of a shared reality. They are different experiential tracks emerging from the same field. Once this is seen, identity begins to shift. You are no longer just a passive observer at the mercy of external conditions. You are not a thinker trapped inside a brain trying to reason your way to a better outcome. You are awareness experiencing a selectively collapsed version of an infinitely richer reality. The brain is the interface. The selection is the key. Frustration often comes from believing the dial is fixed. From assuming that perception is an accurate report rather than a curated feed. When reality feels repetitive, limiting, or stuck, it is rarely because the field has nothing else to offer. It is because the same frequencies are being selected again and again. Not consciously. Not deliberately. But consistently. This is not about learning a new belief system. It is about remembering a function that has always been operating. The brain interprets reality, yes, but interpretation is an act of tuning. And tuning determines which version of reality becomes stable enough to be experienced as real. Nothing needs to be forced. Nothing needs to be argued with. The moment you recognize that experience is filtered rather than final, space opens. Possibility returns. The question quietly changes from, why is reality like this, to, what am I tuned into right now? If this recognition resonates, it's because something familiar is being recalled rather than something new being added. Subscribe now to stay within this frequency. Perception is often treated as a window. Something looks out through the eyes, gathers data, and reports what is there. But perception does not work like a window. It works like a filter. And filters do not show everything. They decide what gets through. At any moment, far more information is present than could ever be registered. Sounds beyond hearing range, patterns outside attention, meanings not yet categorized, possibilities not yet considered. The brain does not receive all of this and then interpret it. It cannot. It must reduce. It must choose. Perception is the mechanism that performs this reduction. This selection happens before conscious thought appears. Long before you form an opinion, something has already been highlighted as relevant and something else has already been discarded as noise. What feels like reality is the small portion of the available field that survived this filtering process. Everything else might as well not exist, not because it isn't there, but because it was never selected. This is why perception cannot be neutral. The act of perceiving already shapes the outcome. To notice one detail is to ignore thousands of others. To frame an event one way is to collapse all other framings. The world that seems solid and obvious is actually the end result of countless exclusions that never announce themselves. Consider how quickly perception organizes experience. Before you decide what something means, it has already been grouped, categorized, and placed into context. Before you think about what matters, attention has already been steered. This is not a flaw. It is a function. Without selection, experience would be unusable. But once this is understood, it becomes clear that what you experience is not simply what is there. It is what was allowed through. This explains why reality feels consistent even when it is not complete. The brain favors coherence over accuracy. It prioritizes patterns that fit together smoothly and suppresses information that would complicate the picture. Gaps are filled automatically. Ambiguity is resolved quickly. The result is a seamless experience that feels objective, even though it is heavily curated. Nothing here requires belief. This is observable. Pay attention to what stands out in a room and what disappears into the background. Notice how quickly meaning forms and how rarely it is questioned. Perception moves faster than reflection. By the time awareness arrives, selection has already happened. This is the destabilizing insight. If perception selects, then experience is not fixed. It is stabilized. The world you live in is not the full field of what is possible, but the subset that has been consistently emphasized. Change the emphasis, and different information becomes visible. Not because the world transformed, but because the filter did. This does not mean perception is wrong. It means it is powerful. It shapes lived reality by determining what counts as real in the first place. Before interpretation, before explanation, before conclusion, there is selection. And selection is the quiet architect of experience. Once this is seen, perception is no longer taken for granted. It becomes something to notice rather than something to trust blindly. And that noticing creates space for a deeper question to emerge: if perception is selecting, what is doing the selecting, and on what basis? Two people can stand in the same place, witness the same event, and walk away living in entirely different worlds. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is a structural feature of perception. The environment may be shared, but the experienced reality is not. What each person lives through is the result of what was selected, emphasized, and stabilized in awareness. From the same field of information, different details are highlighted, different meanings are formed, and different sequences of significance unfold. These differences are not cosmetic. They determine what feels real, relevant, threatening, promising, or possible. This is where the idea of timelines becomes grounded rather than fantastical. A timeline is not a dramatic leap into another universe. It is an experiential track formed by consistent selection. When perception repeatedly highlights certain patterns and ignores others, a coherent stream of experience emerges. That stream feels continuous, personal, and obvious. It feels like my life. But it is only one of many possible ways the same field could be experienced. Consider how quickly divergence happens. One person notices tension in a room, another notices opportunity. One registers subtle discomfort, another registers nothing at all. These are not interpretations layered on top of a shared reality. They are different realities taking shape in real time because different information is being collapsed into experience. Once a particular track is selected, it reinforces itself. What is noticed confirms what is expected. What is ignored remains invisible. Over time, this creates the impression of a stable world with fixed rules, when in fact the stability comes from repeated selection, not from the field itself. This is why lives can look radically different even when circumstances appear similar on the surface. The word timeline simply names this continuity of selection. It points to the fact that experience unfolds along a path shaped by what perception consistently makes real. There is nothing mystical required here. If different information is emphasized, a different sequence of events becomes relevant. Different choices feel obvious. Different outcomes feel inevitable. The world seems to move in a new direction, even though the environment has not fundamentally changed. This also explains why people struggle to understand each other's realities. When two experiential tracks diverge far enough, what feels self-evident to one person can feel absurd or invisible to another. They are not arguing about opinions. They are navigating different perceptual worlds. This is destabilizing because it undermines the idea of a single, objective lived reality. There may be a shared field, but there is no shared experience of it. Each nervous system collapses its own version. Each mind walks a different path through the same terrain. Understanding this removes a subtle form of self-blame. If reality feels narrow, repetitive, or constrained, it is not necessarily because the world lacks alternatives. It may be because a particular experiential track has become dominant. And dominance is not destiny. It is the result of repetition. Two people never live in the same world because perception does not simply reveal reality. It organizes it. An organization determines sequence. Sequence determines continuity. Continuity is what we call a life. Once this is seen, the question shifts again. If multiple experiential tracks are always available, what causes one to become stable while others fade into the background? And what would allow a different track to come into view? Up to this point, the focus has been on perception itself, how reality is filtered, reduced, and stabilized into a coherent experience. Now the question sharpens. If perception is selecting, what determines what gets selected? What opens the filter, and what narrows it? The answer is not thought. It is not belief. It is emotion. Emotion is the primary gatekeeper of perception. Before an experience is named, analyzed, or explained, it is either allowed in or kept out based on emotional state. Emotion sets the level of openness through which information is permitted to enter awareness. This happens automatically, without conscious choice, and far earlier than most people realize. When emotional state is open, perception widens. More data is registered. Subtleties are noticed. Possibilities feel accessible. When emotional state is contracted, perception narrows. Attention tunnels. Information that does not match the contraction simply fails to register. The world does not disappear, but it becomes unavailable. This is not about labeling emotions as good or bad. It is about understanding their function. Emotion is not a reaction to reality. It is a sorting mechanism that determines which aspects of reality become visible in the first place. The brain uses emotional tone as a relevance signal. What matches the tone is amplified. What does not match it is filtered out. Notice how this operates in ordinary experience. In moments of ease, the environment appears richer. Details stand out. Options feel present. In moments of tension, the same environment appears flat, hostile, or limited. This is not because the world changed. It is because the gate narrowed. The range of what could be perceived collapsed. Emotion does not add meaning after perception. It shapes perception itself. It determines what information reaches awareness before interpretation ever begins. This is why attempting to think differently, while emotional state remains unchanged so often fails. The data set has already been restricted. Thought is working with a reduced feed. This gating function is efficient. Without it, perception would be overwhelming. But it is also decisive. Once a certain emotional tone becomes dominant, it repeatedly selects the same kinds of information. Over time, this creates the impression that reality itself is confirming the emotion, when in fact the emotion is determining what reality is allowed to show. This is how experiential tracks become consistent. Not because the environment is fixed, but because the same gate keeps opening and closing in the same way. The same kinds of information pass through. The same patterns become visible. The same conclusions feel inevitable. Understanding this shifts responsibility without blame. Emotional state is not something to suppress or correct. It is something to recognize as guidance. Expansion signals openness. Contraction signals narrowing. Neither is wrong, but each produces a different perceptual world. Once this is seen, emotion is no longer treated as noise interfering with clarity. It is recognized as the mechanism that decides how much of reality is allowed to arrive. And that recognition sets the stage for the next realization: if emotion gates perception, then thought is not leading the process at all. It is arriving afterward, narrating a world that has already been filtered. Thought feels central because it is loud. It comments, explains, judges, and narrates. It arrives with language and certainty, giving the impression that it is in charge. But thought does not lead perception. It follows it. By the time a thought appears, selection has already happened. Before a single sentence forms in the mind, emotional filtering has already shaped what information was allowed in. The data set is already reduced. Certain details are emphasized, others excluded. Thought does not choose what it thinks about. It thinks about what perception has made available. This is not a philosophical claim. It is an observable sequence. Notice how thoughts arise. They do not appear in a vacuum. They respond to what already feels present, relevant, or pressing. And what feels present was determined earlier, quietly, by emotional tone. Thought arrives late to the process, but it speaks as if it authored the outcome. This is why changing thought alone rarely produces lasting change. When emotional filtering remains the same information keeps entering awareness. Thought then rearranges familiar pieces and reaches familiar conclusions. It feels active, but it is working within a closed loop. Thought's real function is narration. It explains what is already being experienced. It justifies reactions. It builds coherence around what perception has delivered. This is useful. Without narration, experience would feel fragmented. But narration is not causation. A story about reality is not the mechanism that produces it. This misunderstanding creates enormous effort. People try to think their way into different experiences while the filter stays unchanged. When it doesn't work, they blame themselves for not trying hard enough or not thinking correctly. In reality, thought is being asked to do a job it was never designed to do. Once this is seen, thought can relax. It no longer needs to force outcomes or maintain control. It can return to its proper role as an interpreter, not a driver. The pressure lifts because responsibility moves to where it belongs, the state that determines what enters awareness in the first place. This does not make thought irrelevant. It makes it accurate. When perception widens, thought naturally reflects that widening. When perception narrows, thought reflects limitation. Thought is a mirror, not a lever. It shows you the shape of your current perceptual world. This also explains why insight alone can feel liberating even before anything changes. When you realize that thought is downstream, the constant self-correction softens. You stop fighting the mirror. You start noticing the source. If this understanding resonates, acknowledge it clearly. Hit the like button now as a direct signal of recognition. Not as agreement, but as acknowledgement that something precise has landed. From here, the next question becomes unavoidable. If emotion gates perception and thought follows that gate, what happens when the system becomes aligned instead of conflicted? What happens when filtering becomes clear instead of distorted? That is where coherence enters, and where experience begins to feel different without effort. Coherence is what happens when the system stops pulling against itself. Emotion, attention, and body state move in the same direction instead of competing. Nothing extra is added. Nothing is forced into place. Distortion simply drops away. And when distortion drops, interpretation becomes clear. Most of the time, these elements are misaligned. Emotion signals one thing, attention is pulled somewhere else, and the body is braced for something that is not actually happening. In that state, perception is noisy. Information arrives fragmented. Experience feels inconsistent or effortful. Reality does not seem to respond because it cannot be registered cleanly. Coherence is not a technique. It is a condition. It arises when emotional tone, attentional focus, and bodily state agree. The body is not preparing for a threat that attention is ignoring. Attention is not forcing itself away from what emotion is signaling. The system becomes internally consistent. When that happens, perception sharpens naturally. This clarity is often mistaken for external change. People say reality started responding differently, as if something out there shifted. What actually changed was the signal. With less internal conflict, the same environment is interpreted with greater resolution. Details that were previously lost in noise become visible. Timing feels precise. Actions feel obvious rather than debated. Coherence does not make perception positive. It makes it accurate. When the system is aligned, information is received without being bent by tension or filtered by unnecessary resistance. This is why calm often precedes insight. Not because calm creates answers, but because it removes interference. When coherence stabilizes, effort drops. Attention no longer needs to constantly correct or override internal signals. The body is no longer tightening against imagined futures. Emotion no longer needs to amplify itself to be noticed. Everything becomes quieter, and in that quiet, interpretation becomes reliable. This is the moment where life appears to flow. Not because events are controlled, but because they are registered clearly. Decisions feel simpler. Responses feel proportional. Experience feels less personal and more precise. Reality seems to cooperate, not because it changed its behavior, but because it is no longer being misread. Importantly, coherence cannot be forced. Trying to manufacture alignment creates more conflict. Coherence arises when resistance ends, when attention stops fighting emotion, and when the body is allowed to settle into the present moment. Allowing creates alignment. Control creates noise. This is why recognition matters more than effort. The moment you recognize misalignment, the system begins to reorganize on its own. Awareness itself introduces coherence because it stops unconscious struggle. The signal clears when it is no longer being distorted by internal opposition. If this recognition is clear to you, anchor it now. Leave a comment stating your declaration, such as, "I am allowing coherence." This is not for discussion. It is a signal of alignment. From here, the next movement becomes inevitable. If coherence clarifies interpretation, then the opposite must also be true. Distortion has a cause. An understanding that cause explains why so many people feel stuck inside narrow versions of reality without knowing why. Up to now, the focus has been on clarity, how perception selects, how emotion gates, and how coherence removes distortion. This movement turns the lens toward the most common source of distortion in human experience. Stress. Not as a lifestyle issue or a problem to solve, but as a perceptual condition that reshapes reality from the inside. Stress narrows the signal. When stress is present, perception contracts. The brain does not simply feel tense while continuing to register the world accurately. It reduces input. It prioritizes speed over nuance, familiarity over possibility, certainty over exploration. This is not a failure. It is an adaptive response. But it comes at a cost. Under stress, the range of information allowed into awareness shrinks dramatically. Attention tunnels toward what feels immediately relevant. Details that do not match the stress pattern drop out. Subtle cues, alternative meanings, and new pathways fail to register. Reality appears smaller, harsher, and more repetitive, not because it is, but because less of it is being received. This contraction reinforces familiar patterns. When the signal narrows, the brain relies on what it already knows. It selects predictable interpretations and well-worn conclusions because they require less processing. Novelty feels threatening. Ambiguity feels unsafe. The result is a perceptual loop where the same kinds of information keep being selected, confirming the same sense of limitation. Stress does not distort reality by adding false information. It distorts reality by excluding information. Possibilities disappear first. Then options. Then nuance. Eventually, only what confirms the stressed state remains visible. This is why stressed perception feels convincing. It is internally consistent. It just isn't complete. In this state, effort increases while clarity decreases. Attention works harder but sees less. Thought becomes repetitive because the input has narrowed. Decisions feel urgent because time appears compressed. The world feels unresponsive not because it stopped offering alternatives, but because the filter has closed around what is already known. This is why stress cannot be solved at the level of thought. Thought is operating inside a reduced data set. It can only rearrange what is available. The more it tries to force solutions, the more the system tightens. Control attempts amplify contraction. Importantly, stress is not a personal failure. It is a signal. It indicates that perception has moved into protection mode. The system is prioritizing survival over exploration. Recognizing this removes blame and opens the door to a different response. When stress is seen clearly as perceptual narrowing, it loses some of its authority. You stop treating its conclusions as absolute. You stop assuming the world really is as small or rigid as it appears. You begin to sense that something is missing from the picture, even if you cannot yet see what it is. This recognition alone creates space. And space is the beginning of expansion. From here, the next question naturally arises. If stress narrows perception by contracting the signal, why do attempts to control or override that state so often make things worse instead of better? Control feels like the obvious response when experience narrows. When perception contracts and options disappear, the impulse is to intervene, to think harder, to override what is being seen. Control promises relief through force. But control is not clarity. It is an attempt to think against perception. By the time control appears, interpretation has already taken shape. The signal has already narrowed. Control does not widen the filter. It argues with the result of the filtering process. Thought pushes back against what perception is presenting, insisting that reality should look different. This internal conflict increases noise rather than resolving it. Control assumes that perception is wrong and thought is right. But thought is downstream. It is working with whatever information has already been allowed in. When perception is contracted, thought has access to less data, not more. Pushing thought harder in that state does not expand reality. It rearranges the same limited pieces with greater urgency. This is why control often intensifies the very condition it is trying to escape. Effort adds pressure to an already narrowed system. The body tightens. Attention becomes more rigid. Emotional tone sharpens. The filter closes further. The world feels even more constrained, and control escalates in response. A feedback loop forms. Control also reinforces the illusion of separation. It frames reality as something external that must be managed or corrected. This increases vigilance and keeps perception oriented toward threat and deficiency. The more reality is treated as an opponent, the less information it offers. The signal degrades under scrutiny. Importantly, control is not a moral failure. It is a protective reflex. When perception narrows, the system seeks certainty. Control feels like certainty. It creates the sensation of doing something. But sensation is not effectiveness. Clarity does not arise from domination. It arises from coherence. Letting go of control does not mean doing nothing. It means stopping the attempt to override what is being perceived. It means recognizing that distortion cannot be corrected from inside the distortion. The filter must change before the picture can change. This is why allowing feels counterintuitive. It removes the familiar sense of effort. It does not immediately replace it with certainty. Instead, it creates space. And space is precisely what a contracted system lacks. When control relaxes, attention softens. The body releases unnecessary tension. Emotional tone has room to shift. As this happens, perception begins to widen on its own. New information enters awareness without being forced. Options reappear not because they were created, but because they are no longer being excluded. This is the critical reversal. Control attempts to change experience by force. Allowing changes experience by removing interference. One adds noise. The other restores signal integrity. Understanding this reframes struggle. The issue is not that reality resists control. It is that control resists reality. And in that resistance, clarity is lost. From here, a deeper insight becomes available. If control contracts perception and allowing widens it, then even discomfort and contrast may serve a purpose. They may not be obstacles to clarity at all, but mechanisms through which the perceptual range is forced to expand. Contrast is usually treated as a problem. Discomfort is labeled as resistance. Difficulty is framed as something that blocks progress. But contrast plays a very different role in perception. It does not exist to punish or delay. It exists to expand the range of what can be registered. When perception becomes too stable, it becomes narrow. Familiar patterns repeat. The same information is selected again and again because it fits what is already known. In that state, the system has no reason to widen. Contrast is the force that interrupts this loop. Discomfort introduces data that does not fit the current filter. It challenges what perception has been selecting by presenting something it cannot fully categorize using existing patterns. This creates friction, not as an error, but as a signal that the available perceptual range is insufficient. Contrast forces attention outward. It breaks automatic scanning. When something does not align with expectations, the brain must register new information to make sense of it. This is how expansion occurs. Not gently, but decisively. New details enter awareness because they cannot be ignored. This is why contrast often precedes insight. When experience no longer fits the existing framework, perception is compelled to adjust. The filter widens, not by choice, but by necessity. Information that was previously excluded becomes relevant. Possibilities that were invisible begin to appear. From this perspective, discomfort is not evidence of misalignment. It is evidence that the system has reached the edge of its current perceptual range. Contrast marks the boundary where expansion becomes possible. Without it, perception would remain confined to what is already familiar. This is also why attempts to eliminate contrast through control tend to fail. Control tries to preserve the existing filter by forcing experience back into known patterns. Contrast resists this because its function is to introduce novelty. When contrast is suppressed, expansion is delayed, and the same limitations persist. Importantly, contrast does not dictate outcome. It only widens access. The new information it introduces can be integrated or resisted. But once it enters awareness, the perceptual landscape is permanently altered. The system cannot unsee what has been registered. This is how experiential timelines widen. A timeline is not changed by force, but by access. When new data becomes available, different sequences of experience become possible. Different responses feel natural. Different directions become obvious. The world seems to open, not because it changed, but because more of it is being perceived. Contrast accelerates this process. It disrupts comfort in order to prevent stagnation. It introduces pressure not to harm, but to expand capacity. From within the experience, this rarely feels benevolent. But from the perspective of perception, it is functional. When contrast is recognized for what it is, resistance softens. The system stops treating discomfort as an enemy and starts recognizing it as information. This alone reduces distortion. The signal begins to widen because it is no longer being fought. Contrast does not exist to keep you stuck. It exists to push perception beyond what it has already stabilized. And once perception expands, experience follows. Not dramatically. Not magically. But inevitably. From here, the arc turns. If contrast widens perception and allowing removes interference, then the present moment becomes the key site where expansion actually occurs. Not in memory. Not in anticipation. But in the only place where new information can ever be registered. Up to this point, expansion has been described as a widening of perception and a reduction of distortion. Now the focus shifts to where this widening actually occurs. Not in memory. Not in imagination. Not in projection. Experience only collapses into something real in one place, the present moment. Reality does not appear all at once. It appears now. The present moment is not a slice of time moving forward. It is the point where perception selects. It is the only interface where information enters awareness. Everything that feels like past or future exists as interpretation layered onto what is happening now. Memory is a present reconstruction. Anticipation is a present simulation. Neither is experienced directly. They are models assembled in the present moment. This matters because perception cannot select anywhere else. The brain does not tune into yesterday or tomorrow. It tunes into what is available now and organizes it using references from memory and projections into possibility. But the raw data always arrives here. This moment is where the signal is received. When attention drifts into the past, perception narrows around familiar patterns. When attention races into the future, perception narrows around imagined outcomes. In both cases, the present is filtered through overlays that are not actually occurring. Information that does not fit those overlays is excluded. The signal becomes distorted. The present moment, when met directly, contains more information than either memory or anticipation. Subtle cues, shifts in sensation, changes in context, emerging possibilities all register here first. This is why clarity often arrives when attention returns to what is actually happening rather than what is remembered or expected. This is not about being calm or mindful. It is about accuracy. The present moment is the only place where perception has access to the full available signal. Past and future are compressed representations. Useful, but incomplete. When they dominate attention, interpretation loses resolution. This is also why reality feels fixed when attention is trapped in time. If perception is repeatedly organized around the same memories or expectations, the same experiential tracks repeat. The same information is selected. The same conclusions feel inevitable. The world appears unchanged because the filter is anchored to what has already been seen. Returning to the present does not create something new. It removes what is unnecessary. It strips away overlays long enough for perception to register what is actually occurring. In that clarity, new data enters awareness. Not because it was created, but because it was no longer filtered out. This is where selection becomes flexible. The present moment is not passive. It is active. It is the point where perception collapses possibility into experience. What is noticed now determines what becomes relevant next. Sequence unfolds from here. This does not mean the present is special or sacred. It is functional. It is where the interface operates. All tuning happens here. All selection happens here. All experiential timelines stabilize here. Once this is understood, effort shifts naturally. Instead of trying to fix the past or secure the future, attention returns to the only place where interpretation can actually change. The now is not a concept. It is the site of reception. And from here, the next realization becomes unavoidable. If experience only collapses in the present moment, then something must be organizing what repeatedly shows up here. Something persistent. something that does not reset each moment. That organizing factor is identity, and it is the filter that never turns off. Identity is often treated as a story about who you are. A collection of traits, preferences, roles, and history. But identity operates long before it becomes a narrative. It functions as a filter. A persistent bias that determines what feels normal, what stands out, and what never even registers. Identity does not wait for each moment to decide how to interpret it. It is already in place. It quietly organizes perception before conscious choice appears. From the vast range of information available in the present moment, identity determines what fits someone like me, and what does not. What fits is allowed through. What does not is filtered out automatically. This is why identity never turns off. Even when attention returns to the present, even when perception widens, identity continues to shape what becomes familiar and repeatable. It is the background setting that stabilizes experience across time. Without it, reality would feel chaotic and discontinuous. With it, reality feels personal and consistent. Identity works through normalization. Experiences that align with identity feel ordinary, expected, and self-evident. They barely register as noteworthy. Experiences that contradict identity feel unusual, uncomfortable, or implausible. They may be noticed briefly, but they rarely stabilize. The filter quickly returns perception to what feels like my world. This is not deliberate. Identity is not choosing consciously. It is conditioning perception through repetition. What has been experienced repeatedly becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes expected. What is expected is selected more easily. Over time, this loop creates the impression of a fixed reality when it is actually a fixed filter. This explains why change feels difficult even when perception briefly expands. New information can enter awareness, but if it does not match identity, it struggles to persist. It feels like an exception rather than a new baseline. The system quietly waits to return to what it recognizes as normal. Identity also explains why certain possibilities feel unrealistic even when there is no external reason they should be. They are filtered out not because they are impossible, but because they are unfamiliar. The brain prioritizes coherence over novelty. It prefers a consistent world to a complete one. Importantly, identity is not a problem to eliminate. It is a function to understand. It provides continuity and orientation. But when it is unconscious, it quietly limits the range of experience that can stabilize. When it is recognized, its grip softens. Recognition does not destroy identity. It loosens its authority. Perception gains flexibility. New experiences are no longer immediately dismissed. The filter still operates, but it becomes adjustable rather than absolute. This is the subtle shift that allows reality to feel different without force. Not because the world changed, but because what is allowed to become normal expanded. Identity begins to reorganize around new data instead of excluding it. Once this is seen, the idea of changing reality takes on a different meaning. You are not trying to alter the external world. You are allowing different aspects of the same world to become familiar enough to remain. And this leads directly to the next realization. If identity determines what becomes visible and repeatable, then experiential change is not about changing the world at all. It is about changing what the world is allowed to show you. The idea of changing reality is seductive. It suggests power, agency, and movement. But it also subtly misleads. It frames reality as something external that must be altered, corrected, or replaced. What actually shifts is not reality itself, but what becomes visible within it. The field does not rearrange itself when experience changes. The field is already full. What changes is access. What you experience at any moment is determined by what perception allows through, what identity normalizes, and what emotional state keeps open. When these filters shift, different information becomes available. Different options feel relevant. Different sequences of events unfold naturally. It feels like reality has changed, but what has really changed is what can now be seen, engaged with, and sustained. This is where timeline language becomes useful when grounded correctly. A timeline is not an alternate universe that suddenly appears. It is a continuous stream of experience made possible by a particular range of visibility. When new information becomes accessible, the sequence of experience reorganizes. Decisions feel different. Responses change. Outcomes follow. From the inside, it feels like stepping into a new version of life. But nothing external had to move for this to happen. Consider how quickly visibility can change. When something new becomes noticeable, it suddenly feels as if it was always there. Opportunities appear obvious in hindsight. Patterns seem clear that were previously invisible. The world did not add anything. Perception simply stopped excluding it. This is why effort aimed at forcing change often fails. Force is directed outward, while the mechanism of change operates inward. You cannot make something visible by demanding it exist. Visibility emerges when the filter that was blocking it relaxes. This also explains why change often feels sudden even when it was prepared gradually. Perceptual shifts accumulate quietly. Emotional states stabilize. Identity loosens just enough. Then, when visibility crosses a threshold, experience reorganizes quickly. The result feels dramatic, but the cause was incremental. Understanding this removes pressure. You are not responsible for bending reality into shape. You are responsible for allowing perception to become accurate enough to register what is already available. This is a very different form of agency. It is not aggressive. It is receptive. When visibility changes, choice changes. When choice changes, sequence changes. And when sequence changes, life appears to move in a new direction. This is what people point to when they say they shifted timelines. They did not leave one world and enter another. They began perceiving a different range of the same world consistently enough for it to stabilize. This reframing restores precision. It keeps experience grounded while honoring its fluidity. Nothing mystical is required. Nothing external must be controlled. The work is internal, but not psychological in the way it is often framed. It is perceptual. Once this is understood, frustration softens. You stop asking why reality will not change and start noticing what is currently invisible. And that noticing alone begins to widen the field. From here, the arc turns toward embodiment. If visibility depends on filters that operate automatically, then the body must play a role before thought ever enters the picture. The next layer of understanding lives there. Up to this point, perception has been described as a filtering process shaped by emotion, attention, and identity. Now the focus moves deeper, beneath thought entirely, to where interpretation actually begins. Before a single idea forms, before meaning is assigned, the body has already set the tone. The nervous system is the first interpreter. The body does not wait for thought to decide how to respond to the world. It registers safety, threat, openness, and constraint instantly. This registration is not conceptual. It is physiological. Muscular tension, breath depth, posture, and internal rhythm all signal how much of the environment is allowed to enter awareness. Perception is tuned here first. This means cognition never starts from neutral. Thought arises within a bodily context that has already shaped what is possible to notice. A regulated nervous system allows more information in. An activated or constricted nervous system filters aggressively. The difference is not subtle. It determines whether perception feels spacious or narrow, fluid or rigid. The body's role is often overlooked because it operates silently. It does not announce its interpretations with language. But its influence is constant. A slight tightening in the chest can reduce curiosity. A shallow breath can limit attention. A braced posture can signal danger where none is present. These signals shape perception before thought ever has a chance to comment. This is why insight alone does not always translate into lived change. Understanding may occur at the level of thought, but if the body remains contracted, perception stays narrow. The same information keeps entering awareness. The same experiential tracks repeat. Thought wonders why nothing is different, unaware that the filter was set earlier. The nervous system's primary function is protection. It prioritizes predictability and survival. When it senses uncertainty, it limits input. This is efficient, but it also constrains experience. When the body relaxes into the present, perception widens automatically. More detail becomes available. More nuance registers. Reality feels richer not because it changed, but because the body allowed it to be seen. Importantly, this is not about fixing the body or controlling sensation. It is about recognition. When bodily state is noticed without resistance, unnecessary contraction begins to release. The nervous system responds to awareness by reorganizing. This is not effort. It is feedback. This also explains why calm cannot be faked through thought. Calm is not an idea. It is a physiological condition. When present, perception expands. When absent, perception contracts. Thought reflects this after the fact, narrating whatever the body has already decided is relevant. Understanding the body as the first interpreter restores coherence to the entire model. Emotion gates perception, thought narrates it, identity stabilizes it, but the body sets the initial bandwidth. It determines how much of reality can arrive in the first place. Once this is seen, attention naturally turns toward regulation rather than control. Toward allowing rather than forcing. The body does not need to be commanded. It needs to be met. From here, the next realization follows naturally. If the body sets perceptual bandwidth, then calm is not a preference or a virtue. It is a condition that expands what can be experienced. And when calm stabilizes, possibility follows. Calm is often misunderstood as the absence of intensity or the suppression of emotion. In reality, calm is not emptiness. It is openness. It is the condition in which the system is not bracing against what might happen next. And that openness dramatically expands what can be perceived. When the body is calm, perceptual bandwidth increases. More information is allowed in. Attention becomes flexible rather than fixated. Subtle cues register. Options that were previously invisible begin to appear. This is not because the world suddenly becomes generous, but because the filter has widened. Urgency does the opposite. Urgency collapses time and narrows perception. When urgency is present, attention tunnels toward a specific outcome. Everything unrelated to that outcome is excluded. The system prioritizes speed over accuracy, certainty over completeness. Possibility shrinks as urgency increases. This is why urgency feels powerful but produces limited results. It creates the sensation of movement, but it restricts the field in which movement can occur. The faster the system demands resolution, the less information it allows itself to use. Choices become reactive. Responses become habitual. The same patterns repeat under pressure. Calm removes this compression. It restores temporal and perceptual space. When there is no immediate demand to fix or escape, perception has time to register more of what is actually present. This expanded input allows experience to reorganize organically. New paths do not need to be invented. They are noticed. Calm is not passive. It is alert without strain. It is engagement without force. In calm, attention can shift easily. The body remains responsive without being defensive. Emotion can move without overwhelming the system. This flexibility is what allows possibility to emerge. This also explains why calm often precedes meaningful change. Not because calm makes things happen, but because it removes the conditions that prevent change from being seen. When urgency relaxes, the filter that was excluding alternatives opens. Reality feels less rigid. Options multiply. Importantly, calm cannot be demanded. Trying to be calm introduces tension. Calm arises when resistance ends. When the system no longer believes it must hurry to survive the moment. This belief shift is subtle, but its effect on perception is immediate. When calm stabilizes, decision-making changes. Choices are no longer driven by avoidance or pressure. They are guided by what feels proportionate and aligned with the available information. Life begins to feel less like a series of emergencies and more like a sequence that can be navigated. This is not a promise of comfort. Calm does not eliminate challenge. It allows challenge to be met with a wider lens. It keeps perception open under pressure instead of collapsing it. Once calm is understood as bandwidth rather than mood, its importance becomes clear. It is not a luxury. It is a functional state that determines how much of reality you are allowed to access. From here, the next insight emerges naturally. When perceptual bandwidth expands and urgency releases, experience often begins to feel cooperative. Not because reality is helping, but because resistance has dropped. And that shift changes how everything appears to move. When perception clears, life often begins to feel cooperative. Events line up. Conversations flow. Timing feels precise. Things seem to move with less resistance. From the inside, it can feel as though reality itself has shifted behavior, as if something external has started helping. But nothing outside has intervened. What changed was distortion. When filters relax, experience organizes itself more smoothly. Information that was previously excluded becomes available. Signals are registered earlier. Context is read more accurately. As a result, responses become better timed and proportionate. Outcomes improve not because the world adjusted to you, but because you are no longer misreading it. Distortion creates friction. It delays recognition, scrambles signals, and forces reaction instead of response. In that state, life feels obstructive. Effort increases. Timing feels off. Opportunities are missed not because they were absent, but because they were invisible. When distortion drops, these same situations unfold differently. This is why alignment can feel like assistance. When perception is accurate, the natural order of events becomes apparent. Actions arise at the right moment. Decisions feel obvious instead of debated. Movement feels supported because it is no longer pushing against incomplete information. Nothing mystical needs to be added for this to occur. Imagine navigating a space with fog. Progress is slow and cautious. When the fog lifts, movement accelerates effortlessly. The terrain did not change. Visibility did. Cooperation is the feeling of clear visibility over time. This reframing is important because it removes dependency on external forces. You are not waiting for reality to decide to help you. You are allowing yourself to register what is already happening. The sense of being guided or supported is the natural result of reduced interference. This also explains why alignment does not guarantee comfort. Clear perception can reveal challenges just as easily as opportunities. The difference is that challenges are met directly rather than resisted blindly. There is less wasted motion. Less internal debate. Less friction between what is happening and how it is being interpreted. When life feels cooperative, it is because signals are being read correctly. Cause and effect are visible. Feedback is immediate. Adjustments happen naturally. The system is no longer fighting itself or the environment. This understanding protects against illusion. You do not attribute alignment to luck, favor, or external reward. You recognize it as a functional outcome of clarity. This keeps you grounded and self-sufficient. It also prevents disappointment when conditions shift, because you understand the mechanism rather than romanticizing the result. As distortion decreases, responsiveness increases. Life feels interactive rather than adversarial. You move with it instead of against it. This is not surrender in the sense of giving up. It is cooperation in the sense of accurate engagement. From here, the arc turns inward one final time. If alignment changes experience without altering the external world, then the deepest shift cannot be about circumstance at all. It must be about who, or what, is actually perceiving. And that realization changes the entire structure of the inquiry. Up to this point, the exploration has stayed within experience, how perception filters, how emotion gates, how clarity or distortion changes what appears. Now the inquiry turns towards something more fundamental. If all of this is happening, who is it happening to? And what, exactly, is doing the perceiving? It is tempting to answer quickly. The brain. The mind. The nervous system. But each of these is something that can be observed. And anything that can be observed cannot be the observer. The brain is not the knower of experience. It is an interface through which experience appears. It receives signals, filters information, organizes perception, and presents a coherent stream. But the brain itself is known. Sensations from it are felt. Thoughts produced by it are noticed. Images generated by it appear and disappear. Something is aware of all of this. That something is not the brain. This distinction is subtle but decisive. When you say, my brain, you are already pointing to a relationship. Ownership implies awareness. The brain is part of the content of experience, not the source of awareness itself. It is a sophisticated instrument, but an instrument nonetheless. The brain interprets reality, yes. But interpretation is an activity that appears within awareness. The knowing of interpretation is prior. You do not need to think in order to be aware of thinking. You do not need to analyze in order to notice perception. Awareness is already present before any process begins. This is where disidentification starts, not as a belief, but as recognition. You notice that sensations come and go. Thoughts arise and dissolve. Emotional tones shift. Perceptual clarity changes. Through all of this, something remains constant. Something is present, observing change without changing itself. This is not an abstract idea. It is directly accessible. Right now, whatever you are experiencing is being known. That knowing is effortless. It does not require interpretation. It does not need to filter. It does not select. It simply is. The brain's role is functional. It tunes perception, collapses experience, and organizes a usable world. But it does not own awareness. Awareness is not inside the brain. The brain appears inside awareness as part of the experience being known. This inversion changes the entire framework. You are not a brain trying to perceive reality correctly. You are awareness witnessing a brain doing what it does. When this is seen, the urgency to fix perception drops. The struggle to control experience softens. The system no longer feels like it has to solve itself. Disidentification does not remove the brain's function. It contextualizes it. Perception continues. Interpretation continues. Identity patterns may still arise. But they are no longer taken to be who you are. They are seen as movements within experience. From this vantage point, clarity deepens naturally. Distortion loses its grip because it is no longer personal. Alignment feels simpler because nothing is being defended. Experience unfolds, and awareness remains unchanged. This sets the stage for the final recognition. If awareness is the knower and does not filter, then it does not participate in distortion at all. It simply sees. And seeing that changes everything. Awareness does not filter experience. It does not select, prioritize, or exclude. It does not decide what matters or what should be ignored. Those functions belong to perception, emotion, identity, and the nervous system. Awareness is prior to all of them. It is what allows them to be noticed at all. This is a crucial distinction. Up to now, the exploration has traced how experience is shaped, narrowed, expanded, and organized. But awareness itself is untouched by these processes. It does not contract under stress. It does not widen with calm. It does not distort or clarify. It simply knows whatever appears. Filtering requires effort. It requires comparison, relevance, and orientation. Awareness does none of this. It does not operate by preference. It does not lean toward one sensation and away from another. It is equally present with clarity and confusion, with calm and urgency, with coherence and distortion. This is why awareness is transparent. It has no content of its own. It takes the shape of whatever is being experienced without becoming that experience. Thoughts appear in it. Sensations appear in it. Emotional tones arise and dissolve within it. Perceptual shifts occur within it. Awareness remains unchanged. Because awareness does not filter, it does not need to be improved. It does not need to be trained, expanded, or refined. It is already fully present. What changes is not awareness, but what awareness is aware of. The confusion arises when awareness is mistaken for the processes that appear within it. When perception narrows, awareness knows narrowing. When perception widens, awareness knows widening. It does not participate in either. It does not prefer one over the other. This is why awareness itself is not disturbed by distortion. Distortion only affects the content of experience, not the knowing of it. This recognition removes a subtle but persistent effort. The effort to become clearer. The effort to stay aligned. The effort to maintain a particular state. Awareness does not need to hold any state. It simply witnesses whatever state is present. This does not make experience irrelevant. It contextualizes it. Perceptual shifts still matter. Coherence still changes what is visible. Identity still stabilizes experience. But none of these define what you are. They are movements within what you are. When this is seen, identification loosens naturally. You no longer confuse the clarity of perception with the clarity of awareness. You no longer assume that confusion means you're lost or that alignment means you're found. These are conditions of experience, not conditions of being. Awareness is present when experience feels open and when it feels contracted. It is present before interpretation and after interpretation. It does not arrive late and does not leave early. It does not improve with insight and does not diminish with misunderstanding. This is the quiet simplicity at the core of everything discussed so far. The entire structure of perception, filtering, and selection appears within awareness, but awareness itself remains untouched by the structure. Once this is recognized, there is nothing left to achieve at the level of awareness. Nothing to fix. Nothing to reach. What remains is not a future outcome, but a present fact. And resting in that fact changes how everything else is held. From here, only one movement remains. Not a new understanding, but a stabilization. Not a technique, but a remaining. A simple willingness to stay where interpretation is clear without trying to improve it. There is nothing new to add now. No mechanism left to explain. No correction required. What remains is a stabilization. A staying. A willingness to remain where interpretation is clear without trying to improve it. Clarity does not need maintenance. It needs allowance. When perception is understood as selective, when emotion is seen as a gate, when the body is recognized as the tuner, and when awareness is known as prior to all of it, something settles. Experience continues, but it is no longer taken personally. Interpretation still happens, but it is no longer confused with truth. The system functions, but it is no longer believed to be what you are. Remaining here is not a practice. It is an orientation. It is the choice to not re-identify with contraction when it appears, and not to cling to expansion when it arises. Both are movements within experience. Neither defines you. In this remaining, the body naturally softens. Not because it is told to relax, but because it no longer needs to defend an identity. Attention becomes simpler. It rests more easily in what is present. Emotion moves without needing justification. Interpretation becomes accurate because it is no longer pressured to protect a story. This is embodiment without effort. Life continues to present contrast. Perception will still widen and narrow. Identity patterns may still surface. None of this is a problem. Clarity does not mean permanence of a state. It means transparency about what is happening. It means not confusing the weather for the sky. When interpretation is clear, experience feels grounded. Not elevated. Not dramatic. Grounded. Decisions arise without urgency. Responses match situations instead of reacting to imagined futures. The sense of cooperation continues, not because reality is assisting, but because resistance has dropped. Remaining here does not mean withdrawing from life. It means engaging without distortion. It means letting experience inform action instead of fighting it. It means allowing perception to adjust moment by moment without demanding certainty. This is the frequency that has been described throughout this entire transmission. Not a mood. Not a belief. A way of being oriented toward experience. Calm receptivity. Accurate seeing. Recognition over effort. Nothing more is required. If this clarity resonates, remain within it. Subscribe now to stay within this frequency, and share this with someone who needs to hear it.